Okay, here we go. Week 8, Chapter 7, Race and Ethnicity, Intro to Soc. When people think of Canada, what stereotypes usually come to mind? I like to ask my international students this. They think of very common things when they think of Canada. So they think of cold weather and snow-capped mountains and lots of forests. They think of beavers. I had to find a cute picture of a beaver. They think of the RCMP. We do have an international reputation for being multicultural and for being proud of that fact. And by that, what I mean is that we don't have this forced on us. It's not a matter of tolerating diversity. It's a matter of us desiring diversity. We have a reputation for being a very diverse country. It doesn't require people to renounce the culture of their country of origin in order to also be Canadian. We have a reputation for being a country that accepts difference, whether that difference is ethnic or religious. And these are all very positive stereotypes that are partially true, and other nations look at us in many ways as a positive example of how to not just handle diversity, but how to encourage it. According to Statistics Canada, their report in 2013, immigrants to Canada stem from over 200 different ethnic and racialized groups, and they speak over 200 different languages. So think about that for a minute. Over 200 different ethnic and racialized groups speaking over 200 different languages. That in itself is evidence, if evidence is needed, indicating that Canada as a whole, both officially and in an everyday sense, values diversity. Now, also cited from Stats Can in 2013, roughly 1 in 5 Canadians were born outside the country, so that our foreign-born population is approximately 21%. And we are a very diverse country. We have the highest foreign-born population of any G8 country, or should I say G7 country, since Russia was kicked out of the summits. And Germany is the next with 13%. So even 21% with us and 13% with Germany, that's quite a difference. When somebody becomes a Canadian citizen, they become governed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is a Bill of Rights entrenched in our Constitution. This establishes equal rights for all Canadians, quote, guaranteeing equal treatment before and under the law, and equal protection and benefit of the law without discrimination, quote. But this Charter of Rights did not always exist, and we know that historically speaking, inequalities have been perpetuated in Canada. And even with our national pride and diversity in the Charter, this does not mean that Canada is perfect in the manner that it interacts with various ethnic and racial groups, either historically or currently. Canada has had and continues to have prejudice, an attitude that judges a person on his or her group's real or perceived characteristics. Now the question is prejudice actually embedded in our culture? Think about it. We're surrounded by images of racial and ethnic stereotypes all the time. Are these harmful? Or do they have a negative effect on us as individuals and on society as a whole? Are they actually expressions of racism and prejudice? Consider the casually racist imagery on TV in cartoons. South Park, The Simpsons, King of the Hill. What do these cartoons suggest to society about the people they're based on? Don't get me wrong, I understand that it can feel we're putting so much effort into being politically correct that sometimes common sense doesn't seem to factor into the equation. But the fact is, we're faced with these images every day, with racialized representations of different ethnic groups. And it is implicitly implied that these racialized representations are okay because they're a joke. Don't take it so seriously. So we watch various television shows and movies and we play video games. But at what point do these racialized representations incorporate these stereotypes and become part of them just a little bit. And all of these tiny little suggestions then combine to have a bit of influence in how they see the world around them. If you think of Chef on South Park, big black guy always trying to be a player with women. On South Park, there is Chief Runs with Premise, and that's his actual name on the show. Happily making money running a casino because all reserves support themselves that way. Keep in mind, these are stereotypes. We have Gerald and Sheila Broflovsky. Your typical overbearing Jewish mother who nags all the time, is really overprotective, downright smothering. There we go. We've got the city walk guy. Never speak English properly, eyes that are so slanted they look like they're always closed. Loogie, who is this little kid who's, it's like a kid's mafia stealing teeth when kids lose their teeth. And, you know, typical mafia guy, dressed in the suit, always eating pasta. Not ethnic and racial, but even stereotypes in terms of the police in the show. You know, Officer Bar Brady, fairly incompetent and stupid. Then I don't know if you remember the cartoon King of the Hill, but it takes place in Texas, and Dale Dribble on King of the Hill is your typical redneck Texan who's narrow-minded and ignorant, constantly thinking up conspiracy theories, and puts his own right to gun ownership above everything else. Depending how old you are, you might remember Speedy Gonzales. This is more like from when I was a kid. Cartoon mouse, really, really exaggerated Mexican accent, always wearing his sombrero. And somebody who's received a lot of attention in the past year, exactly because it's a racial stereotype, is from The Simpsons. Apu Nahasapima Pedalon, the East Indian guy that owns the Quickie Mart on The Simpsons. He's not very smart, always trying to make a buck, only eats curry, has lots of kids, his wife is easily taken advantage of. And as far as Canadian stereotypes, there used to be Bob and Doug McKenzie. Canadians who, again, are not very smart, always wearing their toque, kind of like people in the North, and they're always saying A at the end of a sentence. Now, to focus on one particular group, Italians face very, very strong stereotypes in the media. So what are some of these stereotypes? That they're always hypocritical when it comes to morality and religion. So they're really Catholic, but they bend the rules when they want to for their own financial gain with the mob, because they're all in the mob in some way. And then they just go to confession and everything's forgotten. Stereotype that they always have really loud and boisterous families. They decorate their house and their yard with the Italian flag everywhere. The National Italian American Foundation has said, and this is a quote, "Can we laugh at ourselves? Of course we can. Maybe once, twice, 50, or even 100 times. But the 1,000th time, there is a problem," end quote. And every year, the National Italian American Foundation hands out what it calls its Pasta Toot Award of the Year to the Italian American that they feel has sold out the Italian culture the most. So past recipients have included the creator of The Sopranos, David Chase, ex-New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, because he would frequently do father impersonations, and he was openly fascinated with The Sopranos. When it was originally on TV, Jersey Shore faced a ton of criticism for promoting this tiny subculture as representative of the entire Italian culture. Guys with gold chains, hair is full of gel, not very intelligent, not much in the way of manners. Women all wear a ton of makeup, tight clothing, kind of inappropriate clothing. None of them had any real knowledge of the Italian culture. No proper diction when speaking. Kind of really no taste. The more cheap and garish looking, the better. There were several attempts by various Italian American organizations to get the show banned. Some sponsors pulled out and would not advertise with MTV when it was on. And there were even court injunctions to try to get MTV to stop airing it. And then when the show went to Italy to film for 1 year, they actually had quite a bit of difficulty finding a town that was willing to allow them to film there because they were looked down upon so much for perpetuating such negative stereotypes about Italians. And this can lead into the continued controversy over mascots. Are mascots based on a racial or ethnic group complementary? Are they offensive or somewhere in between? Is it racist to use a big, smiling, traditional Native American head with bright red skin as your mascot? Some people feel that complaints against these kinds of mascots are the work of just a handful of complainers making a lot of noise. An example of our society, trying to be too politically correct. Others argue it's actually honoring an ethnic group by using them as a mascot. Others feel it dumps everybody into the same category without recognizing the vast differences that exist. Whether you think this is an example of political correctness run amok, or you think these changes should occur because society has evolved, and so should the way we as a society treat each other, it's impossible to know to what extent they have influenced our thought processes. So Canada has had and continues to have prejudice, an attitude that judges a person and his or her group's real or perceived characteristics. We have experienced and continue to experience discrimination, unfair treatment of people because of their group membership. Some Canadians have had and absolutely continue to have racist attitudes, the belief that a visible characteristic indicates group inferiority and justifies discrimination. And sometimes this can lead to institutional racism. So what this means is not just that individuals in society have a racist attitude, but that social institutions in society have adopted racial attitudes. Now, are we generally speaking a more fair, more equitable country than a lot of other countries in the world? I don't think it's arrogant to say that yes, absolutely we are. But our self-perception as a safe haven for immigrants and refugees, and our public perception as being a wholly positive, fair, and equitable, completely multicultural country is not exactly true either. Let's start at the ground level here. Let's start at the beginning with what race is. You might think you know what race is, but from a sociological perspective, there's more to it than just physicality. From a sociological perspective, is a social construct used to distinguish people in terms of one or more physical markers, usually causing a profound effect. So, there are going to be certain physical characteristics that a group of people have in common. Certain commonalities physically, such as maybe physical features or skin color, or maybe hair texture, maybe a tendency to be shorter or taller. And these physical characteristics do make up part of the concept of race from a sociological perspective. But it's important that you realize that these physical differences are socially significant and that they lead us to have certain advantages or disadvantages in life. Depending on where a person lives in the world, their skin color could have a lot to do with what opportunities they do or do not have. Their skin could have a lot to do with how people automatically perceive them, with assumptions that people make about them. These are physical differences that cause other people to have certain perceptions or ideas about them, to come to certain conclusions about them, but they do not cause differences in behavior. So having dark skin or eyes that are of a certain shape or a certain kind of hair or being of a certain height do not cause behavioral traits. So let's relate this directly to a commonly perceived stereotype. Being black or being African American does not cause somebody to break the law. The color of their skin does not cause somebody to break the law or to be a law-abiding citizen. And you're probably thinking, yeah, of course it doesn't, Jennifer. I'm not stupid. I know it doesn't. I know someone is not going to act a certain way simply because their hair is of a certain texture, because their hair is a certain color. This is prejudice. This is an attitude that judges a person on his or her group's real or perceived characteristics. And prejudice leads to discrimination, unfair treatment of people because of their group membership. So with this in mind, we can accurately say then that while race does refer to physical characteristics, it's also a social construct. Race is a social construct used to distinguish people in terms of one or more physical markers, usually causing a profound effect. One or more physical markers are used to distinguish someone as part of a particular group. But it's also a social construct in that these physical markers cause a profound social effect. It is the effect of race that is socially constructed. It's like you have a certain skin color, so society imposes certain social constructions on you. Your eyes are a certain shape, so we impose certain social constructions on you. So again, physical difference don't cause differences in the behavior of various races. Race is a socially defined category of people whose physical markers are perceived to be socially significant. Separate from this is an ethnic group, which comprises people whose perceived cultural markers are socially significant. So language and customs and values and religion. Race is based on physical differences. Ethnicity is based on cultural differences. Just like physical differences don't cause differences in the behavior of various races, cultural differences do not usually cause differences in the behavior of various ethnic groups. Why? Because the social structure of a country often is at the base of cultural differences. In other words, how the social structure of Canada treats a group of people is going to affect their culture. Let's look at Canada's First Nations people. Historically speaking, Indigenous Canadians have been outright discouraged from having pride in their languages, their art, their behavioral customs. Indigenous people in Canada have been discouraged from feeling good about their food, their preferred style of dress, even how they traditionally wear their hair. So the social structure of Canada, has affected the culture of First Nations people in Canada. Canada's First Nations people have experienced much more prejudice and discrimination than any other racial or ethnic groups. And it's this disadvantage that then strongly contributes to their lesser degree of educational success, their lesser degree of economic success. Now, conversely, the textbook provides a good example to demonstrate this point and clarify it, looking at Korean immigrants who have come to Canada and comparing them to Canada's First Nations people. Korean immigrants and other groups of immigrants are often looked upon favorably because they have been so successful in Canada. But what many people don't realize or do not acknowledge is that those who come to Canada were already usually fairly successful in their home countries, and they continue that success and build on in Canada with less prejudice and discrimination here than First Nations people. So while certainly as a group they might have faced prejudice or discrimination here, overall the social structural conditions of Canada facilitated their success. The fact that they faced less prejudice and discrimination. The social structural conditions of Canada that they encountered provided them the means to continue emphasizing typical middle-class values like education and family and economic success. So, resources and opportunities. These two factors are key in determining the economic success of an ethnic or racial group. What kind of resources have First Nations people had? I've sometimes heard people say, well, you know, they were given land, they were provided reserves to live on. That might be true, but these were often very undesirable parcels of land, unsuitable for farming or other methods of sustainability. So the Indian Act of 1876, 10 years after Confederation, legally allowed the Canadian government almost total control regarding how Indigenous Canadians lived, including where they lived, when they were allowed to travel. So they would have to actually apply for permission to leave a reserve. It allowed the government total control of health care and also their education. So you're not going to be tested on the information that's on this slide. I'm just giving you details about the Indian Act. The Indian Act stated the government would control how their children would be educated, how they would be taught, what they would be taught, where they would be taught, with no input of any kind from Native people themselves. This is why the term self-government is so important now, as well as the term Indian education. An amendment to the Indian Act in 1884, still focusing on forced assimilation, authorized the forced removal of children to residential schools, again with the goal of forcing them to develop a value system in common with non-native children. In other words, a value system that was the same as the white value system, based on European values and perspectives. And it also, ironically, stripped any First Nations person who managed to be educated, who managed to maybe obtain a university education, of their First Nation rights, which was kind of contradictory to wanting assimilation. So, as most people who have gone through the Canadian school system know, the primary goal of residential schools was complete assimilation, a shared value system. So they openly demeaned First Nations customs and promoted Christian values in various ways, not just academically. Students were only allowed to play English or French games like cricket and soccer, only allowed to wear non-native clothing, only allowed to have their hair cut that way, to speak English or French, and to pray in a Christian manner. The academic curriculum of residential schools was, in a sense, similar to that of public schools, but each day, at least half the day, if not more, was spent working around the school. So the students' work detail meant that they spent half the time on classroom instruction as white students. So right from the start, they weren't treated equally in how the schools were structured. So again, resources and opportunities are the two factors that are key that determine the economic success of an ethnic or racial group. Some ethnic and racial groups have had a lot more of these than others. Historically speaking, it has been WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who have enjoyed the highest degree of both of these.